What if I told you that on a quiet Tuesday morning in downtown Seattle, a homeless veteran named Marcus Thompson was about to marry the woman he believed was a struggling waitress named Sarah Martinez? What if I told you that this same woman was actually Sarah Chen, the 34-year-old CEO of a tech empire worth $2.3 billion? And what if I told you that neither of them knew the other was living a complete lie? The wedding was supposed to be a small, intimate ceremony at the Riverside Community Center. 15 guests. Simple vows. A modest celebration. But by the time the ceremony ended, everyone in that room would question everything they thought they knew about love, money, and the masks we wear to protect ourselves from the world. This isn't just a story about deception. This is a story about two people who were so afraid of being rejected for who they really were that they created entirely different versions of themselves. And when those carefully constructed identities came crashing down on what should have been the happiest day of their lives, what happened next would change not just their lives, but the lives of everyone who witnessed it. You see, the real shock wasn't that Sarah had hidden her billions. The real shock wasn't that Marcus had his own devastating secret. The real shock was what they chose to do when the truth finally came out. Before we start this incredible story, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. To understand how we got to that wedding day, we need to go back 18 months earlier. Sarah Chen was standing in the marble lobby of her downtown Seattle headquarters, looking out at the city she had conquered. Innovate Tech Solutions had just signed a deal that would make her company the fastest-growing artificial intelligence firm on the West Coast. The press was calling her a visionary. Forbes had put her on their cover. She had everything she had ever dreamed of. But Sarah Chen was miserable. She grew up in a one-bedroom apartment in Tacoma with her grandmother, who cleaned office buildings at night and took care of Sarah during the day. They had nothing. Sarah remembered wearing the same 3 outfits to school, rotating them so people wouldn't notice. She remembered the way other kids looked at her when she brought free lunch tickets to the cafeteria. She remembered promising herself that one day, she would have so much money that no one could ever look down on her again. And she had kept that promise. But something had gone wrong along the way. Every man who had tried to date her in the past 5 years had either been intimidated by her success or obviously interested in her money. The conversations were always the same. They wanted to know about her investments. They wanted her to fund their business ideas. They wanted access to her network. They wanted everything except her. Sarah had started to believe that maybe her grandmother was right. Maybe money changed people. Maybe it was impossible to have real love when you had real wealth. Maybe the price of success was loneliness. That's when Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find out if someone could love her for who she really was, not what she had. But to do that, she would have to become someone else entirely. Sarah Martinez was born on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She rented a small studio apartment in Belltown under her new name. She walked into Murphy's Diner on Pine Street and asked for a job. When the owner, a 60-year-old man named Frank Murphy, asked about her experience, she lied. When he asked about her references, she lied. When he asked why she needed the job, she told him she was struggling to make ends meet. That part, at least, felt true. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she could breathe. Nobody at Murphy's Diner knew about her penthouse apartment in Bellevue. Nobody knew about her fleet of luxury cars. Nobody knew about the board meetings and the stock options and the pressure to always be perfect. Sarah Martinez was just a waitress who worked the night shift and barely made enough to pay her rent. It was exactly what she wanted. Marcus Thompson had been living on the streets of Seattle for 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Army's 82nd Airborne Division. He had been a sergeant, responsible for the lives of 12 other soldiers. He had been decorated for bravery. He had been the kind of soldier who wrote letters home to his men's families when they couldn't find the words themselves. But when Marcus came home, he found that the world had moved on without him. The nightmares started first. Then the flashbacks. Then the drinking. His fiancée left him. His job at the construction company didn't work out. The medical bills from his service-related injuries piled up. His parents, who had never approved of his decision to enlist instead of attending college, told him he had made his bed and now he had to lie in it. So Marcus found himself sleeping in doorways and under bridges, carrying everything he owned in a backpack that had once carried supplies through the mountains of Afghanistan. But even though he had lost everything, Marcus had not lost his dignity. He had not lost his sense of honor. And he had not lost his hope that someday, things would get better. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Marcus volunteered at the Riverside Community Center, helping other veterans navigate the maze of services available to them. He didn't get paid for this work, but it gave him purpose. It reminded him that he still had something to offer the world. And every night, when his volunteer shift was over, Marcus would walk 6 blocks to Murphy's Diner. He would order a cup of coffee and sit at the counter, reading whatever book he had found that day. He would nurse that coffee for as long as Frank would let him stay, because the diner was warm and bright and full of the kind of normal human activity that made him feel less alone. That's where he first saw Sarah. She was working the night shift, moving between tables with the kind of efficiency that comes from necessity. She was beautiful, but it wasn't her beauty that caught Marcus's attention. It was the way she talked to the customers. She remembered their names. She asked about their families. She treated everyone with the same kind of respect, whether they were downtown businessmen or homeless veterans like himself. When she brought Marcus his coffee, she smiled at him the same way she smiled at everyone else. She didn't look through him or around him the way most people did. She looked at him like he was a person worth seeing. "How are you doing tonight?" she asked. "Better now," Marcus said, and he meant it. They started talking. Small conversations at first. The weather. The news. The book he was reading. Sarah never asked about his living situation, and Marcus never volunteered the information. But somehow, in those brief exchanges, they began to build something that neither of them had expected to find. Trust. Marcus started looking forward to Tuesday and Thursday nights in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in years. He would finish his volunteer work at the community center and walk to Murphy's Diner, knowing that Sarah would be there. Knowing that for a few minutes, he could sit at that counter and talk to someone who saw him as more than just another homeless veteran. He had no idea that the woman serving him coffee was worth more money than he could count. He had no idea that she was living a lie just as elaborate as his own. He had no idea that she was about to change his life forever. The friendship between Sarah and Marcus developed slowly, like a photograph emerging in a darkroom. Night after night, conversation after conversation, they began to reveal pieces of themselves to each other. But these were carefully curated pieces, edited versions of their true stories. Sarah told Marcus that she was originally from California, that she had come to Seattle to start over after a bad relationship. She said she was taking night classes at the community college, trying to improve her situation. She said she was barely making ends meet, but she was hopeful about the future. Marcus told Sarah that he had served in the military, that he was between jobs, that he was staying with friends while he got back on his feet. He said he volunteered at the community center because he believed in giving back. He said he was working on some personal issues but felt optimistic about turning his life around. Neither of them was entirely lying. They were just not telling the whole truth. What was real was the connection they felt. When Marcus talked about his time in Afghanistan, Sarah could hear the pain in his voice, and she wanted to comfort him. When Sarah talked about her struggles to make ends meet, Marcus could see the determination in her eyes, and he wanted to help her. They were both running from something, and they recognized that quality in each other without naming it. 3 months into their friendship, Marcus started staying at the diner later and later. Frank Murphy, the owner, noticed that his homeless customer was helping Sarah clean up after closing time. Instead of kicking Marcus out, Frank started paying him $20 a night to mop the floors and take out the trash. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sarah watched Marcus work, and she was struck by how careful he was with everything. He swept every corner. He wiped down every surface. He arranged the chairs with military precision. This wasn't someone who was lazy or looking for handouts. This was someone who took pride in doing things right, even when no one was watching. Marcus watched Sarah interact with difficult customers, and he was impressed by her patience and kindness. When drunk college students got loud and disrespectful, she handled them with grace. When elderly customers needed help reading the menu, she took the time to explain each item. When other homeless people came in looking for warmth, she made sure Frank wasn't looking and then gave them free coffee. This wasn't someone who was bitter about her circumstances. This was someone who had been knocked down but was still fighting to get back up. They started walking together after the diner closed. Sarah would walk Marcus to the bus stop, and then she would take the bus back to her apartment in Belltown. She told him she was getting a ride from there. He told her he would be fine getting home. They were both lying, but they were both protecting each other from the truth. During these walks, they talked about everything and nothing. Marcus told Sarah about the books he was reading. Sarah told Marcus about her dreams of starting her own business someday. Marcus shared stories about his military friends. Sarah shared stories about her grandmother, who had raised her. They talked about movies and music and philosophy and what they wanted their lives to look like in 5 years. They never talked about money. They never talked about the fact that Marcus was sleeping in a homeless shelter. They never talked about the fact that Sarah was running a billion-dollar company during the day. They talked about the things that mattered to them, the things that made them who they were underneath all the external circumstances. And slowly, without either of them quite realizing it was happening, they fell in love. 6 months after they first met, Marcus Thompson did something he hadn't done in over 3 years. He bought flowers for a woman. They were just carnations from the grocery store, nothing fancy. But Marcus had saved for 2 weeks to buy them. He had taken on extra hours helping Frank with inventory. He had returned bottles and cans he found on the street. He had counted every dollar twice before spending it. Sarah was working the evening shift when Marcus walked into Murphy's diner carrying those flowers. She looked up from the coffee pot she was cleaning and saw him standing there, nervous and hopeful, holding a bouquet that probably cost more to him than most people's car payments. "These are for you," Marcus said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah took the flowers, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. In her real life, men had given her expensive jewelry, exotic vacations, designer handbags. But no one had ever given her something that represented sacrifice. No one had ever given her something that cost them more than they could afford. "They're beautiful," she said, and she meant it. "I know they're not much," Marcus said. "But I wanted you to know that you're important to me." Sarah looked at this man who had nothing and was giving her everything, and she felt her heart break and heal at the same time. She reached across the counter and took his hand. "You're important to me too," she said. That night, after the diner closed, they walked to the waterfront. They sat on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay and watched the ferries cross back and forth between Seattle and the islands. The city lights reflected on the water, and for the first time in months, Sarah forgot about her other life. She forgot about board meetings and stock prices and the pressure to always be perfect. She just sat there holding hands with a man who made her feel like the best version of herself. Marcus, meanwhile, was thinking about the future for the first time since he had come home from Afghanistan. He was thinking about getting a real job, finding a real apartment, building a real life. He was thinking about what it would be like to wake up next to someone who knew him and loved him anyway. They started spending more time together outside of the diner. On Sarah's days off, they would meet at the community center where Marcus volunteered. Sarah would help serve lunch to other homeless veterans, and Marcus would watch her interact with people who had even less than he did. She never judged anyone. She never looked uncomfortable. She treated everyone with the same dignity and respect. Sarah started to understand the extent of Marcus's situation. She saw where he slept. She met the other people who shared his circumstances. She began to comprehend the daily challenges he faced, the small humiliations and large obstacles that came with being homeless in America. And Marcus started to understand the extent of Sarah's struggles. He saw her tiny apartment, her threadbare clothes, her determination to make something of herself despite the odds. He began to appreciate the strength it took for her to maintain her optimism when life kept knocking her down. They were both falling in love with people who didn't really exist. But they were also falling in love with the parts of each other that were most real. Their kindness, their resilience, their capacity to hope. The irony was devastating, but neither of them could see it yet. Living a double life was becoming increasingly difficult for both Sarah and Marcus, but for different reasons. Sarah's days were a constant juggling act. She would leave her penthouse apartment at 5 in the morning, dress in expensive suits, and spend 8 to 10 hours making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. She would attend board meetings where people hung on her every word. She would review contracts that could make or break entire companies. She would give interviews to financial journalists who called her one of the most powerful women in tech. Then, at 6 o'clock, she would drive to her small apartment in Belltown, change into her waitress uniform, and transform into Sarah Martinez, the struggling woman who served coffee and cleaned tables at Murphy's Diner. She would listen to Marcus talk about his day, his dreams, his fears. She would go home to her studio apartment and lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long she could keep up the charade. The guilt was eating her alive. Every time Marcus looked at her with love and admiration, every time he told her how proud he was of her for working so hard, every time he shared his hopes for their future together, Sarah felt like she was betraying him. She was falling in love with his honesty while living a lie. But she was also terrified of telling him the truth. What if he felt manipulated? What if he couldn't handle the difference in their circumstances? What if he thought she had been mocking him, playing games with his life? What if he walked away? Sarah had never been more afraid of losing something in her life. Marcus, meanwhile, was dealing with his own complicated relationship with the truth. His story about staying with friends was becoming harder to maintain as winter approached. His story about being between jobs was becoming less believable as weeks turned into months. His story about working on personal issues was becoming more transparent as Sarah got to know him better. But Marcus was also hiding something bigger than his living situation. Something he had never told anyone, not even the counselors at the VA hospital. Marcus Thompson was not just any homeless veteran. Marcus Thompson was the son of Robert and Elizabeth Thompson, who owned one of the largest construction companies in Washington state. Marcus Thompson had a trust fund worth over $2 million that he had never touched. Marcus Thompson had parents who called him every few months, begging him to come home, to accept help, to let them fix his life. Marcus had been living on the streets by choice, not by circumstance. He had been punishing himself for something that had happened in Afghanistan, something he believed was his fault, something he thought he deserved to suffer for. The trust fund sat untouched because Marcus didn't believe he deserved comfort or security or an easy life. But now, for the first time since he had come home, Marcus was thinking about using that money. Not for himself, but for Sarah. He was thinking about getting an apartment where she could move in with him. He was thinking about helping her pay for those community college classes she kept talking about. He was thinking about building a life together. He was thinking about proposing. The engagement ring cost Marcus $600, which was every penny he had saved from his work at the diner and every bottle he had returned over the past 2 months. It wasn't much of a ring, just a small diamond in a simple setting from a discount jewelry store downtown. But it represented everything Marcus had to give. He had no idea that the woman he was planning to propose to could have bought that entire jewelry store without making a dent in her bank account. He had no idea that she was hiding wealth that could solve every problem he thought they had. He had no idea that his own secret would soon collide with hers in ways that would change everything. The proposal happened on a Thursday evening in March, in the same waterfront park where Marcus and Sarah had first held hands. Marcus had been planning it for weeks, but he was so nervous that he had almost lost his courage 3 different times. Sarah was tired that night. She had spent the day dealing with a crisis at Innovate Tech involving a product launch that had gone wrong. She had been in meetings since 7 in the morning, putting out fires and managing damage control. When she arrived at the diner for her shift, all she wanted was to see Marcus and feel like Sarah Martinez again, the simple woman with simple problems. But Marcus seemed different that night. He was more quiet than usual, more thoughtful. He kept checking his watch and looking toward the door. When her shift ended, he asked if they could take a longer walk than usual. They walked to the waterfront, to their bench, to the place where they had shared so many conversations about their dreams for the future. The moon was full, and the water was calm, and the city looked like something from a postcard. Marcus turned to Sarah and took her hands in his. She could feel that he was trembling. "Sarah," he said, "I need to tell you something." For a moment, Sarah's heart stopped. She thought he had figured out her secret. She thought he was going to confront her about the lies she had been telling. She thought their relationship was about to end. "I love you," Marcus said, and Sarah felt herself breathe again. "I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. I love your kindness and your strength and your determination. I love the way you treat people. I love the way you make me want to be a better man." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. This was the man she loved, telling her he loved her back, and she had never felt more happy or more guilty in her life. "I don't have much to offer you," Marcus continued. "I don't have a house or a car or a savings account. I don't have a college degree or a steady job or a family that would welcome you with open arms. But I have my heart, and I want to give it to you completely." Marcus got down on one knee, right there on the waterfront, and pulled out a small velvet box. "Sarah Martinez," he said, "will you marry me?" Sarah looked down at the ring, this small diamond that had cost Marcus everything he had, and she thought about the jewelry collection in her penthouse apartment. She thought about the designer engagement ring her last boyfriend had given her, a ring that cost more than most people's annual salary, a ring she had returned because she knew he was only proposing because he wanted access to her money. This ring was different. This ring meant something. This ring represented love, not transaction. "Yes," Sarah said, through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed as the ferries moved across the bay and the city lights twinkled around them. It should have been the perfect moment. It would have been the perfect moment if both of them hadn't been living lies. That night, Sarah went back to her studio apartment in Belltown and called in sick to innovate tech for the first time in her career. She sat on her small bed, looking at her engagement ring, and tried to figure out how to tell the man she loved that everything he thought he knew about her was wrong. She decided she would tell him after the wedding. She would marry him as Sarah Martinez, and then she would reveal the truth about Sarah Chen. She would explain that she had been afraid of being loved for her money instead of herself. She would show him that she could take care of both of them, that they would never have to worry about money again. She would make him understand that the love was real, even if the circumstances were manufactured. She had no idea that Marcus was lying awake in his shelter that same night, making his own plans to reveal the truth. She had no idea that he had already contacted his parents, asking them to help him access his trust fund. She had no idea that he was planning to surprise her with a real apartment and a real future, funded by money he had never wanted to touch. They were both planning to reveal their secrets after the wedding. They were both planning to build their marriage on honesty and trust. They were both planning to start their new life together with the truth. But the truth was going to come out much sooner than either of them expected. Wedding planning should have been a joyful time for Sarah and Marcus, but instead, it became an increasingly complex web of deception and anxiety. Sarah wanted a small ceremony. She insisted on it. She told Marcus that she didn't have family to invite, that she preferred intimate gatherings, that she wanted their wedding to be about them and not about impressing other people. The truth was that Sarah was terrified of anyone from her real life discovering her double existence. But keeping the wedding small meant managing every detail carefully. When Marcus suggested they register for gifts, Sarah panicked. She couldn't risk having wedding registries associated with her fake name showing up in any kind of database. She told Marcus she didn't believe in wedding registries, that she preferred practical gifts or no gifts at all. When Marcus wanted to place an announcement in the local newspaper, Sarah had to talk him out of it. She said she was a private person, that she didn't want strangers knowing their business. Marcus didn't understand, but he respected her wishes. Sarah was also struggling with the financial aspects of the wedding. Marcus was insisting on paying for everything himself, using money he was scraping together from his work at the diner and his volunteer activities. He wanted to rent the community center where he volunteered. He wanted to buy a simple wedding cake from the grocery store. He wanted to take care of everything because he believed it was his responsibility as the man to provide for his bride. Watching Marcus stress about money when she could have paid for the wedding of his dreams without thinking twice was torture for Sarah. She wanted to help, but she couldn't figure out how to offer financial assistance without raising suspicions. She started making anonymous donations to the community center, hoping they would reduce the rental fee for Marcus. She began finding excuses to give Marcus small amounts of cash, claiming she had gotten tips or found money or won small lottery prizes. Marcus accepted these gifts because he thought Sarah was trying to contribute to their wedding expenses, but he was also working extra hours to make sure he could pay for everything himself. He was sleeping less, eating less, and pushing himself to exhaustion because he wanted to give Sarah the wedding she deserved. The irony was heartbreaking. Here were two people who loved each other deeply, both trying to protect and provide for the other, both making sacrifices that were completely unnecessary, both living in fear of revealing truths that might actually bring them closer together. Meanwhile, Marcus was dealing with his own wedding planning challenges. He had contacted his parents for the first time in over a year, asking them to attend his wedding. Robert and Elizabeth Thompson were shocked to hear from their son, and even more shocked to learn that he was getting married. They had been trying to find Marcus for months, hiring private investigators and working with social services to track him down. They had been desperate to help him, to bring him home, to repair their relationship. When Marcus called them, they were overjoyed. But Marcus didn't tell them about his living situation. He didn't tell them that he had been homeless for over 2 years. He didn't tell them that his fiancée thought he was staying with friends. He simply asked them to come to his wedding and to be respectful of his new life. Robert and Elizabeth Thompson agreed to attend, but they were confused by the location Marcus gave them. The Riverside Community Center was not the kind of place they expected their son to be getting married. They were even more confused when Marcus asked them not to mention his trust fund or his family's wealth. He told them that Sarah came from a different background and that he didn't want her to feel uncomfortable. His parents agreed to this request, but they decided to give Marcus access to his trust fund as a wedding gift. They wanted him to have financial security as he started his new life. They wanted him to be able to provide for his bride. They had no idea that their son had been living in poverty by choice, and they certainly had no idea that his bride was wealthier than they were. The wedding date was set for the first Saturday in May. The guest list was small: Marcus's parents, a few of his friends from the community center, Frank Murphy from the diner, and Sarah's supposed friend from her community college class, who was actually Sarah's assistant Jessica, whom Sarah had convinced to play the role of her only friend. Jessica was the only person who knew about Sarah's double life, and she was increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. She had been helping Sarah maintain her cover story for months, but she was worried about what would happen when the truth came out. She kept urging Sarah to tell Marcus the truth before the wedding, but Sarah insisted she needed more time. 2 weeks before the wedding, disaster struck. Sarah's company was featured on the cover of Seattle Business Magazine, with Sarah's photograph prominently displayed. The article was about successful women in tech, and it praised Sarah Chen as one of the most innovative CEOs in the Pacific Northwest. Marcus saw the magazine at the grocery store while he was shopping for wedding supplies. He was standing in the checkout line, thinking about his upcoming marriage, when he glanced at the magazine rack and saw a face that looked familiar. He picked up the magazine and stared at the cover, trying to figure out why the woman in the photograph looked like someone he knew. The woman on the cover looked like Sarah. But it couldn't be Sarah. The woman on the cover was wearing an expensive suit and standing in front of a skyscraper. The woman on the cover was identified as Sarah Chen, CEO of Innovate Tech Solutions. The woman on the cover was described as a billionaire entrepreneur who had built her company from nothing. Marcus bought the magazine and read the article 3 times. He studied the photographs. He looked at the biographical information. He tried to convince himself that it was just a coincidence, that this successful businesswoman just happened to look like his fiancée. But the more he looked at the pictures, the more certain he became. The woman on the cover of Seattle Business Magazine was Sarah Martinez, the waitress he was going to marry in 2 weeks. Marcus felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his relationship was suddenly in question. Who was Sarah, really? Why had she been lying to him? What did she want from him? Was their entire relationship some kind of game to her? But as Marcus sat in his car outside the grocery store, reading about Sarah's company and her success, he began to think about his own secrets. He began to think about his own lies. He began to think about the trust fund he had never mentioned, and the parents he had never introduced, and the life he had been hiding. Marcus realized that he had no right to be angry about Sarah's deception when he had been deceiving her just as thoroughly. Marcus realized that they were both hiding from the truth, both afraid of being known completely, both scared of losing each other if their real selves were revealed. Instead of confronting Sarah immediately, Marcus decided to wait until after the wedding. He decided to marry her first and deal with the truth later. He had no idea that his decision would lead to the most shocking wedding ceremony anyone in that room would ever witness. The morning of the wedding, Sarah Chen woke up in her penthouse apartment in Bellevue at 5:30, 3 hours before she was supposed to wake up as Sarah Martinez in her studio apartment in Belltown. She couldn't sleep. She had been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she was about to do. Today, she was going to marry Marcus Thompson. Today, she was going to promise to love, honor, and cherish a man who didn't even know her real name. Sarah got up and made coffee in her gourmet kitchen, then walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Lake Washington. She owned this view. She owned this apartment. She owned a company that employed over 3,000 people. She owned stocks and bonds and real estate and art collections and more money than she could spend in several lifetimes. In 3 hours, she was going to put on a wedding dress she had bought at a discount store and pretend to be a woman who could barely afford to pay her rent. Sarah's phone rang. It was Jessica, her assistant, calling from her own apartment. "Are you ready for this?" Jessica asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I keep thinking I should call it off. I keep thinking I should tell him the truth." "It's not too late," Jessica said. "You could still tell him before the ceremony." "What if he walks away?" Sarah asked. "What if he thinks I've been mocking him this whole time? What if he thinks I'm just some rich woman who was playing games with his life? What if he understands?" Jessica countered. "What if he loves you enough to forgive you? What if he's relieved to know that you'll never have to worry about money again?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to tell him after the wedding," she finally said. "I'm going to marry him as Sarah Martinez, and then I'm going to reveal the truth. I'm going to show him that I chose him over everything else in my life. I'm going to prove that the love is real." "I hope you're right," Jessica said. "But Sarah, what if he has secrets too? What if you're not the only one who's been hiding something?" Sarah thought about this question as she drove from her penthouse to her studio apartment, but she dismissed it. Marcus was the most honest person she had ever met. Marcus was incapable of deception. Marcus was exactly who he appeared to be. She had no idea how wrong she was. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Thompson was sitting in the lobby of the Riverside Community Center, wearing a suit he had bought at Goodwill and holding a bouquet of flowers he had picked from the community garden behind the building. He looked like any other nervous groom on his wedding day, but his nervousness had nothing to do with normal wedding jitters. Marcus had spent the night thinking about the magazine article, about Sarah's real identity, about the lies they had both been telling. He had also spent the night thinking about his own revelations. Earlier that week, he had finally accessed his trust fund. He had used the money to put a down payment on a small house in Ballard, a house where he and Sarah could start their married life together. He had planned to surprise her with the keys after the ceremony. But now Marcus was wondering if Sarah would be surprised by his gift, or if she would be amused by it. After all, what was a small house in Ballard to a woman who owned $1 billion company? Marcus's parents arrived at the community center at 11 o'clock, an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Robert and Elizabeth Thompson stepped out of their Mercedes-Benz looking like they had dressed for a country club event rather than a wedding at a community center. Elizabeth was wearing a designer dress and pearls. Robert was wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. They looked around the community center with barely concealed confusion. This was not the kind of place they had expected their son to be getting married. The building was clean and well-maintained, but it was clearly a place that served people who didn't have much money. The wedding decorations were simple. The flowers were modest. Everything about the setup suggested that this was a couple with limited resources. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Elizabeth asked her husband. "This is the address Marcus gave us," Robert replied. "Maybe he's just trying to be practical. Maybe he's finally learned to be responsible with money." They had no idea that their son had been living in homeless shelters for over 2 years. They had no idea that he had been surviving on the streets by choice, not by circumstance. They had no idea that the woman he was marrying believed he was unemployed and nearly homeless. At 11:30, the guests began to arrive. There were fewer than 20 people in total. Marcus's friends from the community center came dressed in their best clothes, which were clean but clearly second-hand. They were excited to see Marcus getting married, but they were also a little nervous about meeting his parents, who obviously came from a different world. Frank Murphy arrived with his wife, carrying a wedding cake he had made himself. The cake was simple but beautiful, decorated with white frosting and real flowers from his garden. Frank had grown fond of Marcus over the months he had been working at the diner, and he was happy to see him starting a new life. Jessica arrived carrying a small bouquet and wearing a dress that cost more than everyone else's outfits combined, but she had chosen it carefully to look like something a community college student could afford. She was nervous about her role in the deception, but she was also curious to meet the man who had captured her boss's heart. At 11:45, Sarah arrived at the community center wearing her wedding dress, a simple white gown she had bought off the rack at a department store. She looked beautiful, but she also looked terrified. She walked into the building and saw Marcus standing at the front of the room, talking to an older couple she didn't recognize. The man and woman were clearly wealthy, clearly out of place in this setting, and clearly related to Marcus. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Who were these people? Why hadn't Marcus mentioned them? What other secrets was her fiancé keeping? But before Sarah could process these questions fully, she heard a commotion behind her. 3 people in expensive suits had just walked through the front door of the community center. Sarah turned around and felt the blood drain from her face. It was Richard Hawthorne, the chairman of Innovate Tech's board of directors. With him were 2 other board members, Patricia Wells and James Morrison. They were carrying a wedding gift and looking around the community center with the same confused expression that Marcus's parents had worn. Sarah's worst nightmare was coming true. Her 2 worlds were about to collide in the most public way possible. What happened next would be talked about for years by everyone who witnessed it. Richard Hawthorne spotted Sarah across the room and walked toward her with a big smile on his face. "Sarah," he called out loudly. "Congratulations. We were so surprised to get the wedding invitation. We had no idea you were getting married." The room went quiet. Marcus, who had been talking to his parents, turned to see who was calling Sarah's name. Frank Murphy, who had been arranging the cake, looked up with confusion. Jessica, who had been trying to blend in with the other guests, felt her heart stop. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the room, wearing her discount wedding dress, as the chairman of her company's board walked toward her calling her by her real name. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, stepping forward. "I think there's been some mistake. You're looking for someone named Sarah, but my fiancée is Sarah Martinez." Richard Hawthorne stopped walking and looked back and forth between Marcus and Sarah. "Martinez," he said. No, this is Sarah Chen. She's the CEO of our company." "Sarah, what's going on here?" The community center was completely silent now. Everyone was staring at Sarah, waiting for her to explain. Marcus was staring at her with an expression she had never seen before, an expression of hurt and confusion and dawning realization. Sarah looked around the room at all the faces watching her, and she knew that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. There was no way to explain this. There was no way to fix this. There was no way to control what happened next. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I can explain." But before Sarah could say another word, Marcus's father stepped forward. Robert Thompson had been listening to this exchange with growing confusion, but now he was beginning to understand what was happening. "Wait a minute," Robert said. "Are you telling me that this young woman is Sarah Chen, the CEO of Innovate Tech Solutions?" "Yes," Richard Hawthorne replied. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. Sarah is one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the Pacific Northwest. Her company is worth over $2 billion. Robert Thompson turned to look at his son. "Marcus," he said slowly, "did you know about this?" Marcus was still staring at Sarah, his face pale. "No," he said. "I had no idea." "Well," Robert continued, "this is certainly interesting. Because my son has been pretending to be homeless for the past 2 years, when he actually has a trust fund worth over $2 million. Now it was Sarah's turn to stare in shock. "What?" she whispered. Elizabeth Thompson stepped forward, looking embarrassed but determined to clear the air. "Marcus has been living on the streets by choice," she explained to the room. "He's been refusing our help and refusing to access his inheritance. We've been trying to find him for months." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Frank Murphy was trying to understand how his dishwasher was actually a millionaire. Marcus's friends from the community center were trying to understand how their homeless friend was actually wealthy. The board members were trying to understand how their CEO had been working as a waitress. But in the middle of all this chaos, Marcus and Sarah were just looking at each other, both realizing that the person they had fallen in love with was both exactly who they thought and completely different from who they thought. "You're a billionaire," Marcus said to Sarah. "You're a millionaire," Sarah said to Marcus. "You've been lying to me for over a year," Marcus said. "You've been lying to me too," Sarah replied. They stood there in the middle of the community center, surrounded by their confused guests, both wearing wedding clothes, both having been exposed as frauds, both realizing that their entire relationship had been built on deception. And then Marcus Thompson did something that surprised everyone in that room, including himself. He started laughing. Not bitter laughter or angry laughter, but genuine, deep, relieved laughter. He laughed until tears ran down his face, until he had to sit down in one of the folding chairs, until everyone else in the room was staring at him with concern. "This is insane," Marcus said, wiping his eyes. "This is absolutely insane. We're both millionaires pretending to be poor people. We're both hiding from our real lives. We're both so afraid of being loved for our money that we've been living as completely different people." Sarah looked at Marcus laughing, and despite everything that had just happened, despite the embarrassment and the confusion and the fear, she felt herself starting to smile. "We're both idiots," she said. "We're both complete idiots," Marcus agreed. And then Sarah started laughing too. The guests watched in amazement as the bride and groom sat in folding chairs in their wedding clothes, laughing at the absurdity of their situation. The tension in the room began to ease as people realized that Marcus and Sarah weren't angry with each other, they were just overwhelmed by the ridiculous complexity of their shared deception. "So," Frank Murphy called out from across the room, "are we still having a wedding, or what?" Marcus and Sarah looked at each other, both still smiling, both still in shock, both realizing that they had a choice to make. They could call off the wedding and deal with their revelations privately. They could postpone the ceremony until they had time to process everything that had happened. They could walk away from each other and from this complicated mess they had created. Or they could get married right now, as their real selves, in front of everyone who mattered to them, with all their secrets finally out in the open. Marcus stood up and walked over to Sarah. He took her hands in his, the same way he had when he proposed to her on the waterfront. "Sarah Chen," he said, "I fell in love with your kindness, your strength, and your compassion. I fell in love with the way you treat people and the way you make me want to be better. I fell in love with who you are, not what you have. The fact that you're successful and wealthy doesn't change any of that." Sarah felt tears running down her face. "Marcus Thompson," she said, "I fell in love with your integrity, your generosity, and your courage. I fell in love with the way you care about other people and the way you never gave up hope. I fell in love with who you are, not what you've been through. The fact that you come from wealth doesn't change any of that." Marcus smiled at her. "Do you want to marry me? The real me? Do you want to marry me? The real me?" Sarah asked back. "Yes," they said at the same time. And so, in front of a room full of confused but supportive witnesses, Sarah Chen and Marcus Thompson got married as themselves for the first time in their relationship. The ceremony was performed by the same minister who had been scheduled to marry Sarah Martinez and the homeless veteran Marcus. The vows were exchanged with more honesty than either of them had shown in over a year. When they kissed at the end of the ceremony, the room erupted in applause and cheers. Frank Murphy wiped tears from his eyes. Jessica breathed a sigh of relief. Marcus's parents hugged each other with joy. The board members shook their heads in amazement. The friends from the community center hooped and hollered. It wasn't the wedding that either Sarah or Marcus had planned, but it was the wedding they needed. It was messy and complicated and public and embarrassing and absolutely perfect. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Sarah leaned over to Marcus and whispered, "What do we do now?" Marcus whispered back, "Now we figure out how to build a real life together." And that's exactly what they did. 6 months later, Sarah and Marcus Thompson were featured on the cover of People magazine as the couple who found love while hiding from themselves. Their story inspired thousands of people to examine their own relationships and ask themselves whether they were being truly authentic with the people they loved. Sarah continued to run Innovate Tech, but she restructured the company to focus more on social responsibility and helping people in need. Marcus used his trust fund to expand the programs at the Riverside Community Center, creating housing and job training programs for homeless veterans. Together, they established the Thompson Foundation, which provides support for people transitioning out of homelessness. They bought a modest house in the same neighborhood where they first fell in love, and they still go to Murphy's Diner every Tuesday and Thursday night. Frank Murphy always saves their favorite table. Their wedding day shock wasn't just about revealed identities. It was about the revelation that love, real love, isn't about what we have or where we come from or what we've been through. It's about who we choose to be when everything else is stripped away. Sarah and Marcus's story reminds us that sometimes the biggest risk we can take is being completely, authentically ourselves. And sometimes, when we finally have the courage to show someone who we really are, we discover that we're loved not despite our flaws and complications, but because of them.